Hello, everybody. My name is Jacek Bartosiak. Welcome to Strategy and Future. And today my guest is Professor Hugh White. Hello, Hugh. How are you?
Very well. Great to be with you again.
Yeah. Professor Hugh White is based in Australia. People familiar with Strategy and Future for sure remember the outstanding conversations we have had so far. And I'm looking forward to this one very much. So, Hugh, tell us, what is the strategic debate in Australia these days, given the ongoing war in Ukraine, given the increasing tensions, technology and trade tensions between U.S. and China, especially after the United States enacted law on semiconductors, and there are more and more regulations coming. So, what is the temperature? What is the level? What is the direction of the strategic debate in Australia about those two things on both edges of Eurasia, so to speak?
Well, I guess like everywhere in the world, though perhaps a little bit less intensively than you guys in Poland, we're focusing a lot on what's happening in the Ukraine. The Australian government, new Australian government, elected in the middle of last year, has made quite a thing of providing support to Ukraine, more modest than European powers, but quite significant for a country like ours that doesn't get directly involved in European affairs very often. It's just announced yesterday that some Australian troops are going to be training Ukrainian forces, I think, in locations in Germany. And we've provided some armoured fighting vehicles and so on. So there's, we feel ourselves involved. But for Australia, the significance of what's happening in the Ukraine is very much read as a component of the broader pattern of which the US-China rivalry is the main game. And for us, with China as our biggest trading partner and clearly the most powerful country in our region, with America our major ally and the long-term guarantor of our security, managing the relationship between America and China has become really just about the key factor in Australian foreign policy. So one should read our approach to what's happening in Ukraine very much in those terms. Now, in regard to what's happening in the Western Pacific and Australia's approach to it, under the previous government, the Conservative government under Scott Morrison, Australia's relationship with China took a very sharp dive, a really catastrophic dive. China virtually cut off diplomatic or at least ministerial level communication. The trade relationship was significantly scaled back in some sectors. And some very harsh language was used both ways. The new Labor government, which was elected in May last year, has tried to redress that balance by, on the one hand, improving relations with China. It has ceased to do what the previous government did, which was to use China as a political football in the domestic political debate. It has worked to try and improve the tone of relations with China, and in doing that has been responding to some initiatives from the Chinese side itself, and that has worked. We've now had meetings between our Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and Xi Jinping in the margins of the G20 meeting in Bali last year. Our Foreign Minister has made the first Australian ministerial level visit to China in 3 years, and so there's a general air that relationship is improving. On the other hand, the Labor government has absolutely stuck with the very strong commitment to support the United States in Asia. That has been a hallmark of Australian governments of both sides of politics for so long. And it is, for example, fully committed to the AUKUS deal under which Australia is meant to be acquiring nuclear-powered submarines from the United States or Britain, and is very much committed to strengthening Australia's military capability to help support the United States in any confrontation with China down the track. So there's a kind of there's a tension in Australian policy there. And the more US-China rivalry escalates, and the more broadly based that rivalry becomes, for example, as you mentioned, the CHIPS Act and the very harsh economic measures that America has been taking against China recently, the more difficult Australia's long-term balancing act becomes. And I think that's very much on people's minds in Australia, the way in which China is behaving, the way in which the United States is responding, the way in which Australia is becoming increasingly committed to supporting the United States in confronting China militarily, even while it tries to improve the relationship with China. That is, as I said before, almost now the only foreign policy issue Australia or Australians focus on, or the Australian government focuses on. And all of that is amplified by the tensions over Ukraine, because we do see parallels. In Europe, we see Russia trying to reassert itself as a great power, reassert its right to a sphere of influence over its near abroad, and being willing to test both its European neighbours and the United States to see how far they're prepared to go to resist that. In Asia, we see something very parallel. China seeks to reassert itself, as it would see, as the regional great power. It seeks to assert its control over Taiwan as a way of demonstrating its great power status. It seeks, I think, to push the United States out of East Asia. And it's willing to use armed force, the threat of force, or even the use of force potentially, to assert its great power status. And the challenge for us in Asia, as it is, I think, for you in Europe, is to how far to go in risking a confrontation to resist that.
Yeah. Setting aside for a while the military dimension of the US-China confrontation or competition, how do you read the recent moves by the United States government, the CHIP Act that you have mentioned, the rumors that more acts are to come against China, also the very rigid regulations that are also, sort of curtailing the European industry vis-a-vis the American industry, and it's a very noisy subject in Europe, the industrialization of Europe, in the context of also the war in Ukraine and the American foreign policy and economic policy and trade policy in that respect. And in that vein, also the behavior of China, that, maybe I've been preoccupied a lot with Ukraine, and maybe I missed something, but it seems that there were a few major decisions made in Beijing that sort of potentially even saved us from World War III in 2022. First of all, that Chinese didn't help Russia with their sort of Lend-Lease Act, because that might push us towards a major conflagration. And the second thing is that it seems that the Chinese are taking those shots from the US side, like the CHIP Act, and they are still standing without reciprocity, without, acting in revenge. So am I reading it properly? How accurately, how do you read this sort of relationship in that respect?
Yeah, really interesting questions, Jacek. Look, I think the first point to make is that many of the steps the United States has taken, the very protectionist flavour to their renewable energy programs, and of course the CHIP Act and the very strong flavour of protectionism in that, does have two dimensions. One is strategic, particularly in relation to the CHIP Act, of course, that the United States is trying to slow China's development as a technological rival and indeed as a military rival. But also, of course, has a straight domestic political protectionist agenda that is an attempt to rebuild America's own domestic industries. And in doing that, of course, as you say, it hits not just China, but also Europe and other competitors, of Japan too, of course, potentially South Korea too. So even Taiwan. So there's a real tension, I think, in that element of US policy. They want to rebuild their position or reinforce their position as a good ally. On the other hand, they want to protect their own industries. And as we know, stretching all the way back to 1945, one of the foundations of America's alliance building project over the long decades of the Cold War and since then is that it has offered its allies market access. And that is something that it's now moving away from as it seeks to rebuild its own domestic economy. And I think that tension remains unresolved in US policy, and I think that's an important aspect of it. So far as how China responds, look, I do think it's been very interesting to see China's response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Uh, I've always argued that the alignment of Russian and Chinese strategic objectives vis-a-vis the United States is quite close, but quite limited. It's close in a sense, touching on what I said before. Both are trying to contest America's claim to global leadership. Both seek to assert against the United States their own claim to great power status in their own regions. And they both benefit in their meeting their objectives from what the other does. And so I think China has been happy to see Russia contest the US position, for example, in Europe as an adjunct to what China's trying to do in Asia. But I'm not at all surprised that it hasn't been prepared to do for Russia what Europe and the United States has been doing, and Australia for that matter, have been doing for Ukraine, as you say, a kind of a lend-lease. Because I do think China seeks to manage its relationship with the United States very carefully. It wants to push the United States hard, but it wants to be completely in control of how hard it pushes. It doesn't want that relationship to be managed to be jerked around by extraneous factors. And I think they've made the judgment, and I think they're correct. Judgment I think that underlies your question. That is that for China to actively support Russia in its invasion of Ukraine would simply be too provocative to the United States. Because in the long run, I think China wants to ease America out of Asia. It doesn't want a war. It doesn't want a confrontation. It wants America to gradually accept that China's primacy. And I think the kind of crisis that would be generated by Chinese support for Russia would just be, in a sense, a disturbance to China's game plan. On the other aspects, you see, I think China's position in response to economic actions like the CHIP Act have actually been consistent with the way they've responded to US economic actions against China going all the way back to the Trump period, to Trump's term, and that is that they've certainly been grumpy about it. They certainly haven't been pleased about it. But they have wanted to avoid a tit for tat escalation. They've wanted to make it that they wanted to preserve the benefits they can get from their economic access to the US and, for that matter, other Western technology and markets as much as they can. They wanted to make it easy for countries and companies to skirt around the kinds of things the United States has done. So I think that their true response has not been to sort of tit for tat retaliation and so on. I think their true response has just been to do what they've done, and that is to pour massive amounts of money, and I think a fair amount of administrative and policy skill, into building up their own capabilities. And I think the true story behind the CHIP Act is that will be a massive stimulus to China's development of its own chip industry. Of course, it will take it a long time because these things are very complicated. Losing access to the sort of machinery that would have been available had they had access, for example, to the Dutch manufacturers of high precision etching machinery. Of course, that's an inhibition to China. But the idea that the Chinese can't get there eventually, won't get there in a decade or so, I think that's way too optimistic. And a decade might seem a long time in Washington. It doesn't seem long in Beijing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also, if I may add to your points, that this line of this approach that the United States has shown is entirely different from what the United States demonstrated during the Cold War. The nature of the challenge was different. It was basically security and military from the Soviet Union, and the United States had an upper hand in this limited version of globalization among allies of the United States. So,
yes.
This time around, it is in interest of China to keep on globalization, while the United States is trying to revise the system.
That's right.
By threatening and punishing also its own allies.
Yes.
without
Yes.
providing incentives. While during the
Yes.
Cold War, there were incentives in place, starting
Yes.
from Marshall Plan to opening the market. America was the big thing to, main part of the globalization of the time, like, supply chains. This time around, it's China, and I'm not sure, for sure you remember that what the British diplomat Eric Crow, I think his name was,
Yes.
in the Crow Memorandum proposed for the sea power that was dominating the world trade. And this is in the violent breach of the Crow Memorandum's propositions, how the dominant sea power should behave in the open trading system. And I really wonder whether folks in DC remember the
Yeah.
admonitions of Erie Crow Memorandum from the beginning
Yes.
of the 20th century. So, what do you
Look,
think about it?
I think that's exactly right. I mean, it is worth just going back to the basics here and remembering that the whole geopolitical drama that we're seeing in the world today is the product of the failure of the vision we had of the post Cold War global order, which was based on the assumption that the United States would remain as far ahead as we could see, by far the world's predominant economic, technological, and military power. And that turned out simply to be wrong. China has already overtaken the United States as on the most relevant measure, PPP, is the world's biggest economy. Notwithstanding it having a bad year last year and its population problems and so on, the chances of it overtaking the United States on any basis is very high. And so, the United States, which at the end of the Second World War was half of the whole global economy, and remained throughout the Cold War overwhelmingly the world's biggest economy. That's simply not the world we're in anymore. Within the timeframes that are relevant to a lot of our strategic calculations, it won't even be the second biggest economy in the world. It'll be the third biggest economy in the world after India's. And so adjusting our understanding of America's role globally and in our respective regions from an expectation that the United States would be economically, technologically, and militarily dominant to a recognition that America will be one of the world's biggest economies, but not the biggest, far from dominant in global trade. And of course, it'll remain one of the world's most powerful technological players. But looking ahead 25 years, which is not very long in our business, China and India will be major competitors with the United States technologically as well. And of course, in some areas, China's already a major competitor. So I think we all have to adjust our expectations of the United States accordingly. And in a sense, we shouldn't be surprised that the United States sees its economic and technological position slipping. It starts to take steps to reinforce its position, which are going to cost it strategically. And in the long run, United States does face a choice. And we've discussed this before. What price is it prepared to pay to preserve economic price, military price, technological price? Is it prepared to pay to preserve the strategic primacy in Europe and in East Asia that it inherited at the end of the Cold War? And although there's a deep emotional commitment in Washington to preserving that position, I don't see evidence that it's willing to pay the price and bear the burdens involved. And so, for example, if it faces a choice between pleasing European allies by not targeting them under the CHIP Act, or displeasing European allies by keeping them out of American markets and technology and trying to build up America's own base, they'll take the second option. And here's the point. Biden in his own way, as much of an America first guy as Trump was, both face the same imperatives. It's always worth remembering that Biden won office with almost his only foreign policy statement was that he was going to build a foreign policy for the middle class. He was going to build a foreign policy that served the interests of everyday Americans, which is essentially a protectionist agenda. And one of the reasons why I'm pessimistic about the long-term future of American power in Asia, and for that matter, pessimistic about the long-term future of America as a strategic guarantor of the European international order, is that I think as Americans confront the higher costs and risks they're going to have to bear as they confront these ambitious great powers in these two critical regions, they'll decide it's not worth it. And, Ukraine, I think, is turning into a fascinating test of that. Is America prepared to run the risks involved in supporting Ukraine sufficiently to allow Ukraine to score a decisive victory over Russia? And I'm not sure they will. When Joe Biden keeps on saying he's not willing to fight World War III, I think we have to take him seriously.
Yeah, I'm having a few comments to what you have just said. First is that whether we have the cohesion of the West in that respect, because the United States tends to behave as if there were a cohesion, while in fact, also acting, as if it's not. So, by trying to, how the United States is going to convince the Germans to give up their socioeconomic model with access to China, raw resources from raw minerals from Germany, and also surviving under the tough protectionist regulations from the U.S. So, how in the world the United States is going to convince the allies to really join the world ocean camp, as opposed to the continental consolidation that is in the cards? As the German industry is, seeing it over the dead body of Ukraine and probably Poland and other countries. At the same time, if I may, the United States is apparently effectively employing the offshore balance quite cheaply, grinding the land forces of the Russian Federation without the American blood over the horizon in a way, controlling the escalation. So from the purely military perspective, a typical American over-the-horizon military approach, this is the perfect thing for the United States to sustain its presence and political influence in Europe. So what is your take on what I just said?
Well, let me. They're two really good observations. Let me just respond to them in the reverse order. The big question about America's over-the-horizon offshore balancer role in the Ukraine crisis is whether it's going to work. Whether the US can provide, and its allies can provide, Ukraine with enough support to enable Ukraine to achieve something that looks like victory, and there'll be a different discussion about what that looks like, but something that looks like a victory at a price and risk they're prepared to pay, and in particular, whether they can do that without risking Russian retaliation and potential escalation. Now, if they can, that will be a big victory for America, as well as a big victory for Europe. But I doubt that they can. I think Russia is too resolved and too formidable for that. The second point, but it's interesting, and you can of course make the same point about Taiwan. Can America find a way to ensure Taiwan's preservation of the Taiwan status quo without itself being drawn into an actual war with China? That's what America would like, but I don't think it's going to work. I don't think it's possible. I think America has to be willing to fight, has to persuade Russia in Europe and China in East Asia that it's willing to fight if it's going to deter them. And I don't think in the end it is going to be willing to fight, because I think the risks of fighting those nuclear armed great powers is too high for America to bear. The answer to the first question, how does America persuade countries like Germany to continue to accept the new deal that America is offering? Well, look, I think the answer to that is very simple, and that is that it has to persuade them that the only acceptable international order for Germany, say, or Japan, or Australia, or Poland, is one which continues to be characterized by US global primacy. That any shift from there would lead to an order in which those countries' own political systems would be at risk. Now, that's what the United States does when it talks about, when Joe Biden, for example, said in his State of the Union address that we're in a contest with China for the 21st century. There's this whole idea that if China can be allowed to reassert itself as a great power in East Asia, if Russia can be allowed to reassert itself as a great power in its near abroad, then we will find ourselves in a world dominated by authoritarian states. The alternative, of course, is that that's not what we face. What we face instead is a return to something very familiar in Europe, and that is a multipolar order with a number of great powers, with different political systems and different political ideologies, all balancing one another. And the question for Germany is, just to take that as an example, how would Germany feel if it lived in making its way in a world in which China had reasserted itself as a great power in East Asia, India had emerged as a great power in South Asia, Russia preserved its position or reasserted its position as a great power in its near abroad, into the Middle East and into Eastern Europe. Interesting question how far it goes. And Europe emerges as a great power in its own right, collective Europe. Now that seems to me to be a difficult, complex and potentially dangerous world, but not so difficult and dangerous that it would be unacceptable, or at least will be less acceptable than trying to preserve US primacy at the price of fighting nuclear wars against these ambitious great powers. And, I think, it is an important point to make that right at the heart of the policy questions we face about, whether to send Leopard tanks to Ukraine, or how far we should support the United States over Taiwan, are these questions about whether or not we're prepared to accept a multipolar global order, or whether we're determined to preserve what is an essential unipolar global order under US leadership. Now, just to be clear, I would much prefer a unipolar order under American leadership, but I think preserving that in the face of the ambitions of countries like China and Russia is more risky and more dangerous and more costly than it's worth.
So then what is focusing on Europe and Ukraine, what is the definition of victory for Ukraine that is imaginable given the structural forces and formidability of Russia, as you have described that, and also that would be agreed by by Poland and the United States, powers of the region. And so what sort of a solution would create the equilibrium that would save us from warring period in Europe?
I find that a very difficult question to answer. I think it boils down to a fairly simple question, and that is Ukraine prepared to accept an outcome in which it loses territory to Russia? The territory that's been contested since 2014, and of course beyond that, the Crimea itself. And there's the question there which I don't feel I can answer, and that is it possible to imagine? Can we seriously contemplate that Russia would accept a defeat as profound as losing all of the territories that it now claims, plus perhaps even the Crimea, without resorting to an escalation? And the view of a lot of people, the view of a lot of people in the United States, the view of some people in the UK, I know, is that that's possible to imagine, and that's what we should therefore push for. And of course, I can completely see why that's such a desirable outcome. But I fail to be persuaded by their arguments that their confidence that Russia would not be willing to escalate. And if it is willing to escalate, then I think we look at a very dangerous world indeed. So, and if that's true, then we have to ask ourselves, well, how far back must Ukraine step from its preferred outcome? How much, to be blunt, how much territory must it surrender in order to satisfy Russia enough that we work down the risk of reduce the risk of Russian escalation? And I think in some ways the big difference in analyses here between different participants in the debate It's just how seriously they take the risk that Russia would escalate and the risk that escalation would lead to a nuclear exchange. When I look at the arguments that are put forward by a lot of people in the United States, just to take an example, Anne Applebaum, very significant voice on these issues. She seems very confident that Putin can be deterred. I'm less confident of that. I don't know why she's so confident. The idea that a country like Russia, that a leader like Putin, faced with what must seem to him like a very significant threat to what he sees as Russia's vital interests, would not contemplate nuclear escalation, seems to me to fly against the fact that America's own nuclear doctrine envisages the use of nuclear weapons first if America's vital interests, or even the vital interests of America's allies, are threatened. I think the nuclear threshold is lower than these people would like to imagine.
Yeah, I think,
and I can see why, because the idea of Ukraine having to surrender territory to Russia in order to secure a peace that avoids the threat of escalation is very, very terrifying. But I think the alternative might be more terrifying still.
I think that the threshold of using the nuclear weapons has been lowered extensively, and maybe again it's only the Chinese that, in September, deterred Russia from really using them to stop the Ukrainian offensive, because it was not in the interest of China at all, because that would change the convenient balance of power in Western Pacific against China if the nuclear taboo were broken.
I'm not so sure about that, Jacek, for two reasons. That is, it seems to me the issues are so big for Russia that China's displeasure, I don't think, would have made as much impact on Russian decision making as that hypothesis suggests. So I think, as long as Putin believes he has a reasonable chance of rebuilding Russian forces, being able to regain the initiative on the conventional battlefield, then I think he's got good reasons not to want to. Obviously, even for Putin, crossing the nuclear threshold is a very big step to take. So I think, what we're seeing in Russia is an attempt to regain the initiative on the conventional battlefield. And I don't think we should rule out the possibility that happens. Clearly, the performance of the Russians has been astonishingly bad, mostly so far. Clearly, the performance of the Ukrainian forces has been remarkably good. But I don't think we should take it for granted that balance can't shift, and that that's what Putin has faith in. But the other thing is, it's not clear to me that the use of nuclear weapons by Russia in Europe, or even a much starker threat to use nuclear weapons, would necessarily disadvantage China. Because one of the ways in which China can convince the United States to step back in East Asia is to make it really clear to Americans that China too would be willing to use nuclear weapons if it failed to achieve its objectives, its objectives vis-a-vis Taiwan with conventional forces. The United States, I think, in the end, because it's now, I think, widely accepted, the United States can't win a conventional war. I think both sides have to rely on neither can China. Both sides have to rely on the potential for nuclear escalation to win their point. And I think that works in China's favour, because China's stake in the outcome is so clearly greater than America's. So I don't think China would necessarily suffer in its strategic positioning vis-a-vis America in the Western Pacific if nuclear issues became more prominent in the resolution of the confrontation over Ukraine. It would teach America a lesson.
So that your assessment is based on the calculation of stakes as by Schelling, I think, is
yes.
teachings. Yeah. Before we end, my last comment and the question pertaining to Ukraine again, and the peace plan, or what would be the definition of victory. And what do you think about, in terms of the escalation control, nuclear things, sort of the trying to find equilibrium? What do you think about the following solution? or at least the outcome that the Russians are holding some territories that they, seize. But Ukraine is on the fast track to NATO, and Americans are providing the extended nuclear deterrence, the nuclear guarantees to Ukraine, and are pushing the regional allies like Poland and maybe Scandinavians to sign the bilateral military deals with Ukraine.
Yes.
That would be a sort of creating a new equilibrium by providing the guarantees in conventional warfare. Ukraine, in this way, trying to sort of extend NATO in a way, but creating a new framework and also creating a foundation for equilibrium. By giving up some territory to stabilize and remove the threat of nuclear escalation. The Russians would be thinking that they have won something and they are gaining time, just like in the era of Napoleonic Wars. They lost Tilsit, peace deal, but in 2 years' time they were again in war. You know how it works. Because I think we are entering this Napoleonic era kind of stuff, with 20 years of this turmoil before the new equilibrium. The victors and losers are being established, of the new system. So, do you think it's sensible what I just?
Look, I think that's a very intriguing set of ideas, and I think that's a very interesting proposition that Ukraine accepts that it loses some territory. In return, it gets what is in effect, or perhaps in fact, NATO membership. And Russia's forced to accept that.
Yes.
I think that's a perfectly credible solution, but with 2 observations to make. The first is it would depend on a decision by America and by the other NATO allies that they really were prepared to pay the costs of fulfilling the obligations that would flow from that. And, the great story of NATO expansion is that the United States and the countries of Europe gaily took on obligations to the new NATO members, the Article 5 obligations, and on the belief that it was never going to be tested. Now, no one could do that now. So America would have to decide for itself and would have to get through the Senate a commitment to go to war with Russia to defend Ukraine from further Russian incursions. It's just an interesting question as to whether Washington would do that and whether Berlin would do that. I think I've made this comment, Jacek, to you before. One of the great questions, ever since the days of Peter the Great, one of the great questions of European strategy is how far east do you allow Russia to come? And most of the time, since Peter the Great, the answer has been halfway across Poland. And so the question is, would Germany today, would France today, would Britain today be prepared to say that we are willing to go to war with Russia to defend a new status quo, a new Russian western border, roughly speaking, along something like the present line of demarcation? And maybe they would. And if so, that might be the least bad outcome we could hope for. But the second observation I'd make is that would fundamentally change the nature of European security. That is, it would mean that border would be a very heavily armed border on both sides. It would be more like the inter-European border of the Cold War. It would require the deployment not of mixed companies, multinational companies or brigades, but divisions and army corps on Ukrainian territory permanently. And that's not impossible. I mean, that might be the precise implication. If Europe and America decides that America that Russia must be stopped where it is, and that Russia is not going to be allowed to establish a sphere of influence that spreads into Ukraine, then that's what's required. and that might be the outcome. But whether America's really up for that, I think it's still too early to say. This is still in America with a very complex and fractious political debate about the way it sees its strategic future in both in Europe and in Asia.
Yeah. One final observation: for sure, there is no return to status quo, and whatever the outcome of war in Ukraine is, right?
That's right. That's quite right. Yeah. That's quite right.
Yeah. Thank you very much. That was a
great pleasure as always, Jacek. I've enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And for our audience, please stay with us for more to come at Strategy and Future. Thank you very much. Our guest today was Professor Hugh White of Australia.